I'm Eva Masterman. I'm an artist and educator. I moved up to Newcastle from London about 6 years ago for a fellowship, a research fellowship. So I was the Norma Littman Fellow for Ceramics at Newcastle University in the Fine Art Department. So during that time, I decided to apply for a PhD, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. I was making very large sculptural objects. They were mainly things of importance from my childhood. And all of these objects were about embodying relationships and thinking about intergenerational trauma, essentially, and how it's passed down through generations. Because these objects were so big, I was just using the cheapest clay I could find. So it's just a kind of buff stoneware, bog standard one. But I always found it really easy to work with. It's the material that I was introduced to right from the beginning when I started making things out of clay. With glazing and things like that, I never really glazed my objects until fairly recently. I think I've always been quite drawn to the processes of making, more so than what happens to the final objects afterwards. Thinking about and using clay in its raw state, or leaving it unfired, or allowing the properties of clay to speak for themselves, I think has been something that's always interested me. I'd already begun to think about what else I could do before COVID hit, and part of that was a low-key climate anxiety, because obviously ceramics or clay, once it's been fired into ceramic, although it's really fragile, it's basically indestructible. It lasts for centuries. This question about why was I making these objects and who were they for, that has caused a huge shift in my practice, because it's ultimately allowed me the space to do the PhD and focus the last 3 years of my life and my research on creating more sustainable systems and ways of organizing around this new network of clay practice. What I'm going to be showcasing is elements of my PhD research. What I'm creating during the PhD is, I guess, a business or an organization, and it's called the Clay Commons. And the idea of it is to provide a space to hold all of this socially engaged clay practice. So what I've noticed over the last probably about 10 years actually is this changing habit of ceramic makers and educators, but also the public in relation to how they engage with or are interested in clay. And part of that, I think, is to do with the rise of the internet and sort of how-to videos and things like that. But equally, it's also a wider issue around the neoliberalization of our universities and formal education. And so there's been a devaluing in our formal educational spaces of material practice. But what has happened, which I think is really exciting, is that a lot of artists and makers have now picked up this material and are starting to self-organize and create spaces of education and engagement within their communities. So how else can clay support their community? How can we build societies around clay making and creativity? And the Clay Commons is a framework to hold and sustain all of that practice and that thinking. Part of what the Clay Commons is wanting to do is think about this idea of sustainability through an environmental lens, yes, absolutely, but also through a wider societal lens in terms of how we might start to build more sustainable communities. It's not just about making sure that we're recycling our clay and that we're using ethically sourced cobalt and not pouring all of that stuff into our rivers. But it's also about thinking about the sustainability of our community and our society, and what else do we need to survive and sustain and to thrive.